first time today, the Vatican put on public display bone fragments believed to be the remains of St. Peter, the founding pope.
The Catholic Church has stood for over 2,000 years. In that time, it has gathered more than treasure. It has gathered secrets. Some of what it holds sits in museums for anyone to see. Some sit behind glass in old cathedrals. And some sit locked away in sealed rooms, inside silver cases that have not been opened in over 100 years.
Among the treasures saved was the cathedral's most sacred relic, the crown of thorns many believe Jesus wore at his crucifixion.
One of these objects was once so sensitive that the Vatican threatened to excommunicate anyone who even spoke its name in public. Today we are going through 27 religious artifacts the Church has kept away from public eyes, tested by almost no one, and explained by almost nobody. Some of these will shock you, some will disturb you. A few you will not believe are real. 1. The seamless robe of Trier. In Trier, Germany, inside a cathedral older than most nations, there is a robe locked away from the world. Tradition says this is the exact garment Jesus wore on the day he was crucified. The same robe Roman soldiers gambled over at the foot of the cross while he was dying above them. The Church says it has held this robe since the 1200s, brought back from Jerusalem by Empress Helena herself. For almost 200 years, it has been shown to the public only 4 times. In 1891, in 1933, in 1959, in 1996. Each time, millions of people traveled from across the world just to stand near it. But here is what should trouble you. In all that time, the robe has never once been carbon dated. Scientists have been allowed to look at it from a distance. They have never been allowed to touch it, or test it, or prove what it really is. A garment that could confirm or destroy a piece of Christian history, and for 2 centuries, the Church has simply said no. 2. The Sudarium of Oviedo. Almost everyone has heard of the Shroud of Turin. Almost nobody has heard of the cloth kept quietly beside it, in a locked silver chest inside a cathedral in northern Spain. This cloth is called the Sudarium. Tradition says it was wrapped around Jesus' face right after he died. It has been in Spain since at least the 8th century, and for most of that time, the chest holding it stayed sealed shut. When it was finally opened in the year 1075, it was not opened for study. It was opened as a religious ceremony, with a king standing beside it. Today, the cloth is brought out to the public exactly 3 times a year. The rest of the time, it goes back into the dark. Limited testing on the cloth found blood type AB, the same type found on the Shroud of Turin, along with plant pollen that only grows near Jerusalem. That should have opened the door to real investigation. Instead, the chest was locked again, and full scientific study has never been allowed. The evidence exists, the answers do not. 3. The blood of San Gennaro. 3 times a year, thousands of people pack into a cathedral in Naples to watch something the Church calls a miracle. Inside 2 sealed glass vials sits the dried, blackened blood of a bishop, who was executed nearly 1,700 years ago. When the ceremony begins, the archbishop lifts the vials in front of the crowd, and the blood inside turns from solid to liquid, right there in front of everyone. The crowd cheers, then the vials go back into the vault. Scientists have a real explanation on the table. It is called thixotropy, and it describes certain substances that look solid until they are shaken and then turn to liquid. To prove or disprove this, all the Church would need to do is let someone open the vials and test what is actually inside. In 600 years, they have never once allowed it. Nobody outside the Church knows for certain if that substance is even blood. Nobody knows if it is really from the 4th century. The miracle keeps happening, and the one thing that could explain it is the one thing nobody is allowed to touch. 4. The Veil of Veronica. According to tradition, a woman named Veronica wiped the face of Jesus as he carried his cross toward his execution, and his image was left burned into the cloth. The Vatican says it has held this veil since at least the 8th century. Once a year, on a single Sunday during Lent, a priest lifts it briefly from a high balcony inside St. Peter's Basilica, far above the crowd below. Nobody gets close. For the rest of the year, It disappears into a sealed chapel. Almost nobody is allowed to enter. The last person permitted to examine it closely was a single priest back in 1907. He reported that the image on the cloth had faded to almost nothing. Since that day over a century ago, the Vatican has not allowed another close look. So the question becomes simple and uncomfortable. What exactly is being shown from that balcony once a year, if the image itself may no longer even be there? 5. The Titulus Crucis. Inside a Roman basilica sits a small, broken piece of walnut wood, roughly the length of a forearm. This is claimed to be a fragment of the sign nailed above Jesus during his execution, the sign that read, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews," written in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. Unlike most objects on this list, you are actually allowed to see it. What you are not allowed to do is study it properly. The Church controls access so tightly that full independent dating has never taken place. The small amount of testing that has happened revealed something strange. The Hebrew writing runs from right to left, which is correct. But the Latin and Greek letters also run right to left, which is not how either language is normally written. Scholars are still divided over what that detail means. It could point to something ancient and unusual. It could point to a mistake made centuries later. Nobody can say for certain, because the one thing that would settle it, full scientific testing, has never been permitted. 6. The Ethiopian Tablets. In 1868, British soldiers stormed a fortress in Ethiopia and stole hundreds of sacred objects. Among them were 11 tablets, wooden tablets that represent the Ark of the Covenant itself inside the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. These are not ordinary religious items. They are considered so holy that they are always kept covered, and only a priest is allowed to look at one directly. Even a priest from a different Ethiopian church is forbidden from viewing another church's tableau. For over 150 years, the British Museum has held all 11 of them. In all that time, not one has ever been shown to the public. Not one has ever been scientifically studied. They are believed to sit in a sealed room, guarded, untouched, waiting for a return that has never come. This is not the church hiding its own secret. This is a sacred object stolen from a living religion and held in the dark for over a century by Anne. 7. The Christ icon of the Sancta Sanctorum. Inside a private chapel in Rome called the Sancta Sanctorum, meaning the Holy of Holies, there is an icon of Christ the Church describes as not made by human hands. Tradition claims it was started by St. Luke and finished by angels. It has been worshipped since at least the 6th century and is considered one of the most sacred images in the entire Catholic faith. It is kept sealed inside a case covered in silver, gold, and jewels, a case that is almost never opened. The last time scholars were allowed to examine it closely was in 1907, and what they found was troubling. The image had faded to almost nothing. Since then, no outside examination has ever been permitted again. What remains locked inside that jeweled case right now is something only a small circle of Vatican officials actually knows. Everyone else is simply told to believe. 8. The Chair of St. Peter. At the far end of St. Peter's Basilica stands a massive golden throne, built by the sculptor Bernini. For centuries, the Church claimed that hidden inside it was the actual wooden chair once used by the Apostle Peter, the very first pope. In 1968, under Pope Paul VI, the chair was quietly removed and studied by scholars. What they found broke the legend apart. The oldest parts of the chair dated to around the 6th century, not the 1st. Peter had already been dead for hundreds of years by the time this chair was made. The decorative panels carved into the chair did not even show Christian images. They showed figures from pagan mythology. The results were published quietly in academic journals during the 1970s, with no announcement from the Vatican. The chair was placed back inside the golden sculpture, and the truth went with it. In November 2024, the chair was displayed publicly for the first time in 150 years. The Vatican called it the Chair of St. Peter. Nobody mentioned what the 1968 study had already proven. 9. The Spear of Destiny. A Roman soldier named Longinus is said to have driven a spear into the side of Jesus as he hung dying on the cross. The Vatican's version of that spear sits hidden inside a hollow statue in St. Peter's Basilica, brought out to the public exactly once a year, briefly from a high balcony. In the modern era, no independent scientist has ever been allowed to examine it. At least 3 other spears across Europe claim to be the same relic, held in Vienna, Krakow, and Armenia. Scientists tested the Vienna spear, and it dated to around the 7th century, hundreds of years after the crucifixion. The Vatican's own spear has never been dated at all. That leaves only 2 real possibilities. Either the Church genuinely does not want to know what it is holding, or it already knows, and has chosen never to say. 10. The Holy Prepuce. The Holy Prepuce was said to be the foreskin removed from Jesus during his circumcision, 8 days after his birth. At its strangest point, up to 18 different churches across Europe each claimed to hold the true version, and the Church allowed all of them to be worshipped at once. When the Protestant Reformation began mocking the relic publicly, the Catholic Church started quietly stepping away from it. In 1900, the Vatican issued an official warning that anyone who spoke about it publicly could be excommunicated. The most famous surviving version was kept in a small Italian village called Calcutta since the 1500s. In 1983, the local priest announced it had been stolen from his own bedroom. It has never been found. A relic worshipped for centuries. And in the end, it did not need the Church to hide it. It simply disappeared. 11. St. Clare's hair and fingernails. St. Clare of Assisi gave up everything to live a life of poverty, and in 1212, she cut off all her hair as a public sign of that choice. A follower quietly kept the hair instead of letting it be thrown away. Over time, small clippings of her fingernails were saved as well. Today, both are kept inside the Basilica of St. Clare in Assisi, sitting behind glass in a small decorated case. Visitors can walk right up and see them. There is something deeply uncomfortable about it. This is not a painting or a robe. It is hair and fingernails from a woman who has been dead for nearly 800 years, kept on permanent display like a trophy. The Church calls it devotion. Many who see it in person call it something closer to unsettling. 12. The mummified head of Catherine of Siena. Catherine of Siena died in Rome in the year 1380. Her hometown of Siena wanted her back, so her followers made a decision that sounds impossible. They planned to smuggle her severed head out of the city. According to legend, when guards stopped them at the gate and demanded to see inside the sack, they looked inside and saw only rose petals. The men were allowed to pass. When they arrived in Siena, the petals were gone, and Catherine's actual head was back inside the sack. That head sits today inside a glass case in the Basilica of San Domenico. Her skin is dark, tight, and shrunken with age, exactly what you would expect from something over 600 years old. It has been on display ever since, a preserved human face staring out from behind glass at every visitor who walks past. 13. The Devil's Stone. Inside the Basilica of Santa Sabina in Rome sits a large, black, damaged chunk of stone. Legend says this is the same stone the devil himself threw at St. Dominic while he was deep in prayer. The story claims Satan was furious that Dominic kept converting people to the faith and hurled the stone directly at him. It missed and slammed into the floor instead, leaving marks that some describe as claw scratches burned into the surface. Those marks are still visible today. Whether they came from claws or simply centuries of natural wear, the Church has never treated that question as the point. What matters to them is the message. The devil tried to stop one man and failed. The stone has stayed inside the basilica ever since, a permanent reminder built entirely on a story nobody can prove. 14. The Bones of St. Peter. Underneath the main altar of St. Peter's Basilica, hidden inside solid rock, there is a small tomb. Inside that tomb are bones the Catholic Church believes belong to Peter himself. The Apostle Jesus called the rock his entire church would be built on. These bones were found during a secret excavation in the 1940s, ordered personally by Pope Pius XII. For years, nobody outside a small circle even knew the dig was happening. researchers found something that seemed to support the claim: graffiti scratched into the wall that read, "Peter is here," next to bones from a man who died in his 60s. In 2013, Pope Francis finally displayed a handful of these bone fragments to the public for the first time. But real doubt still remains. Some experts argue the bones could have been moved there, or placed there long after Peter died. 15. Saint Francis Xavier's incorrupt body. Francis Xavier died in 1552 on a small island off the coast of China, buried quickly in hot, wet ground, the worst possible conditions for a body to survive. When his remains were dug up months later to be moved, his body had not decayed at all. His body was eventually taken to Goa in India, placed inside a glass coffin, and displayed as proof of divine favor. It still lies there today, but the full truth is more complicated. Over the centuries, pieces of his body were removed and sent elsewhere as separate relics. His right arm was cut off and sent to Rome. His nose has broken down with age, and his skin has darkened and shrunk. A body once presented as untouched by death has quietly been edited for hundreds of years to keep the miracle believable. 16. The Virgin Mary's breast milk. In Bethlehem, there is a small cave known as the Chapel of the Milk Grotto. Tradition claims that while Mary was breastfeeding the infant Jesus inside this cave, a few drops of her milk fell to the ground and turned the stone floor pure white. That stone has been treated as sacred for centuries. Today, the site grinds pieces of that same white stone into a fine powder and sells small packets to visitors for around $2 each. The powder is marketed as a cure. People are told that mixing it into water and drinking it may help with illness or with struggles to have children. It is not tested, not approved, and not regulated in any way. A holy relic tied to the Mother of Jesus has quietly become a small commercial product, sold in packets to anyone willing to believe. 17. Saint Francis Xavier's severed arm. This is the same Francis Xavier whose body lies in Goa, but this relic is different. In 1614, his right arm was cut from his body and sent to the Church of the Gesù in Rome. The reason given was simple. According to tradition, this was the exact arm he used to baptize more than 100,000 people during his life. For centuries, the mummified arm stayed inside its glass case in Rome, the hand still frozen in a blessing gesture. In 2018, for the first time in its history, the church allowed the arm to travel across Canada on public tour. Massive crowds lined up for hours just to see it. A severed human arm, over 400 years old, drawing lines around city blocks, treated less like a body part and more like a celebrity on tour. 18. Relics of Saint Dacian. Inside a church in Manhattan called the Most Holy Redeemer, a glass case beneath the altar holds the bones of a man the church calls Saint Dacian, an early Christian martyr killed during the persecutions of ancient Rome. The bones arrived in the 1800s, donated by a wealthy Italian woman who claimed they were genuine relics. They have never once been DNA tested, and there is a rumor attached to this relic that the church has never addressed directly. Some believe the bones may not belong to an ancient martyr at all, but to a 19th century New York police officer, killed while defending the church from an angry anti-Catholic mob. Nobody has confirmed which story is true. The bones remain exactly where they were placed, dressed in fine robes, resting on velvet, worshipped as an ancient saint who might actually be a modern-day officer whose real story was quietly erased. 19. The mummified hand of St. James the Apostle. Reading Abbey in England was once one of the largest monasteries in the country, home to what was believed to be a mummified hand belonging to James the Apostle. In the 1500s, King Henry VIII shut down England's monasteries and looted their treasures, and countless relics like this one were destroyed or lost forever. This hand somehow survived, hidden inside an iron box by someone determined to protect it. It stayed hidden for centuries, until workers doing repairs stumbled onto the box completely by accident. The hand was dried, shriveled, and wrapped in old fabric, but unmistakably human. It eventually made its way to a church in Marlow, where it was locked away again for years before finally going on brief public display. Experts still cannot prove for certain that it belonged to James. What is certain is that this hand was hidden once by history, and hidden again by the very church meant to protect it. 20. Saint Anthony of Padua's tongue and jaw. Saint Anthony of Padua died in 1231 and was buried like anyone else. 30 years later, when church officials dug up his remains, they made a discovery that shook them. While the rest of his body had decayed normally, his tongue had not. It was still soft and still red, as if it belonged to someone alive. His jawbone and the tissue around his vocal cords were also in strangely good condition. The church saw this as a sign from God, a reward for a man remembered for his powerful preaching. His tongue and jaw were removed and placed on permanent display inside the Basilica of St. Anthony in Padua, where they remain today. Out of an entire human body, the church chose to preserve and display the exact parts tied to the one thing that made him famous: his voice. 21. The Crown of Thorns. The crown of thorns is believed to be the crown forced onto Jesus' head before his crucifixion. The main relic is kept in Paris, brought there in the 1200s by King Louis IX, who reportedly paid more to acquire it than it cost to build the chapel constructed specifically to house it. Over the centuries, the individual thorns were removed one by one and sent out to churches across Europe, each one claiming to be authentic, though nobody can confirm most of them. What remains of the crown itself is a woven circle with no thorns left at all. In 2019, when fire tore through Notre Dame Cathedral, firefighters and clergy risked their lives to pull this relic out before the roof collapsed. Today it sits locked in secure storage, brought out only on rare occasions. A fragile woven circle that survived fire, war, and 800 years of history. 22. The Three Heads of John the Baptist. There are at least 3 separate churches across the world that each claim to hold the actual skull of John the Baptist. One sits in Amiens Cathedral in France. One sits in the Basilica of San Silvestro in Rome. Another sits in the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, Syria. 3 continents, 3 ornate reliquaries, and one very simple problem. John the Baptist only had one head. None of the 3 locations has ever allowed independent scientific testing. None of them acknowledges the other 2 claims even exist. The version in France is generally considered the most credible by scholars, largely because an entire cathedral was built specifically to house it after it was taken from Constantinople in 1206. But credible is not the same as proven. For centuries, 3 different institutions have each told their followers the same story, and not one of them has ever agreed to find out the truth. 23. Saint Teresa of Avila's scattered body. Teresa of Avila was a Spanish nun who died in 1582. When her body was dug up afterward, and it was dug up several times over the years, it was reported to be incorrupt, meaning it had not decayed the way a normal body does. The church took this as a sign of holiness, and instead of keeping her body whole, they divided it. Her heart was sent to a convent in Avila. Her left arm and hand were placed in a glass case in Rome. Her right foot was sent to Lisbon. Other pieces, including part of her jaw and a finger, were scattered to churches across the globe. Each fragment became its own attraction, drawing its own crowd of pilgrims. Her heart, in particular, has drawn the most attention, partly because of visible scarring on it, which some believe was caused by the intense religious visions she described during her life. One woman's body, torn apart and spread across an entire continent, all in the name of holiness. 24. Jesus' umbilical cord. Inside the Lateran Palace in Rome sits a chapel called the Sancta Sanctorum, the place of holy things. To reach it, visitors historically had to climb 28 marble steps known as the Scala Santa. Steps tradition says Jesus himself walked down on his way to trial before Pontius Pilate. Inside this chapel, among some of Christianity's most guarded relics, was something you would not expect to find preserved at all. the umbilical cord of Jesus Christ, kept hanging inside a cross made of pure gold and decorated with fine jewels. This was not hidden in shame. It was displayed as one of the holiest objects the Church possessed. Somewhere in the history of faith, a piece of a newborn's umbilical cord became sacred treasure, locked behind gold, guarded behind 28 steps, and kept from public view for centuries. 25. The bones of Saint Mark. In 828, two merchants from Venice traveled to Alexandria in Egypt with one goal: to steal the bones of the Apostle Mark. To get them out of the country, they hid the remains under thick layers of pork and cabbage, knowing the Muslim customs officials at the port would refuse to touch pork and let the shipment pass untouched. The plan worked. The bones arrived safely in Venice and were placed inside the Basilica di San Marco, where they have been worshipped ever since. But there is a serious problem buried in the historical record. Some accounts suggest the church in Alexandria knew the theft was coming and quietly swapped the real remains for something else before the merchants ever arrived. To this day, the bones inside that basilica have never been scientifically confirmed to be Mark at all. For nearly 1,200 years, an entire cathedral may have been built around a decoy, and nobody has ever been allowed to check. 26. Mary Magdalene's arm. Inside a Dominican monastery in Rome, a right arm and hand are kept in a container shaped like the limb itself, made of glass and gold. According to tradition, this is the exact arm Mary Magdalene used to anoint the feet of Jesus, which is why it is treated as one of the most sacred relics tied to her. It is displayed only occasionally, kept under tight security the rest of the time. This is not the only piece of her the church claims to hold. Her skull is said to be in France. Various bones, strands of hair, even a single tooth are scattered across other churches in Europe. But there is no real evidence connecting any of it back to her actual first-century burial. Most likely these relics appeared centuries later, during a period when churches were desperate for sacred items to raise their status. The arm in Rome is treated today exactly like the real thing, worshipped by pilgrims for generations, with no real proof it ever belonged to her at all. 27. The skeleton of Saint Boniface of Tarsus. Inside a church in Munich, a full human skeleton lies on display, completely covered in gold, silver, and jewels, dressed in elaborate robes. The church calls it Saint Boniface of Tarsus, a Roman soldier said to have converted to Christianity and been executed in the 4th century for refusing to worship Roman gods. But the real story behind this skeleton is far darker than the legend. During this period, skeletons were regularly dug up from Roman catacombs, given the name of a saint nobody could verify, wrapped in gold, and shipped out to churches across Europe that needed a relic to attract worshippers. There is no actual proof these bones belong to anyone named Boniface at all. This was not one isolated case. It was a system, an entire trade in unidentified bones, rebranded as martyrs and sold as sacred. Behind the gold and the jewels on display in Munich sits a skeleton with no name, no history, and no proof, dressed up and presented to the world as a saint.